Very much, Professor Ito, Professor Watanabe, and to the Japanese Forum for International Relations. It's a real honor to participate in this forum. Professor Ito asked me to talk about the convergences in Indo-Pacific strategies with regards to the maritime domain. And with that, I'm going to focus on three areas building from John's comments. One is stability through rules, two is governance, and three is coordination. And I would like to focus on three particular areas. First is traditional security, two is non-traditional security, and three is resilience. Canada is not a claimant of any of the South China Sea issues, but it looks at the South China Sea and the sea lanes of communication, their management, through the lens of trade. About $5.5 trillion of trade goes through the sea lines of communication annually, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Those imports and exports fuel the second, third largest economies, and of course the 10th largest economy, South Korea. And with that, Canada, European Union, as well as individual countries in Europe, all have a stakes in stability within the Indo-Pacific and those maritime sea lanes. And this is where this idea of stability through rules is critically important to ensure that the arteries of trade and energy imports continue to fuel our economies and create stability within the region. The question is, as John mentioned, where do we dedicate our resources in terms of governing? And this is a really complicated issue, but again, I think there's three areas of traditional security, non-traditional security, and resilience. And where we see alignment of many countries with their interests in the Indo-Pacific really stems from three particular areas. One, of course, is the rules-based behavior in the maritime domain. Two is stemming weapons of proliferation on the Korean Peninsula, and here we see governance through sanctions evasion programs with Canada and other countries through operations such as Operation Neon. And we also see strengthening ASEAN intra-regional integration as a key tool to building a code of conduct within the region to help manage the sea lanes. We see growing alignment between Canada and other middle or secondary powers in terms of contributing to monitoring and surveillance activities within the region. They understand, as John mentioned, that it's not just about deterring China. We have to think about piracy, illegal fishing. We have to think about non-state actors as important destabilizers of sea lanes of communication that we also need to focus our efforts. And of course, there's strong concerns about peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits and what a kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Straits would mean for those sea lanes of communication that really provide those critical arteries to bring in imports and exports and energy resources to the region. So we see in terms of governance and coordination that we need to think about not only state actors, but non-state actors, that we need to think about ways to coordinate our activities in terms of gray zone operations, managing lawfare. And I should remind you that in 2021, our Chinese friends adopted a new Coast Guard vessel that allows them to use force. This is very complicated in terms of how we manage their behavior in and around the Senkaku Islands, but also in the islands in and around the South China Sea. In the areas of non-traditional security, which I think are equally important, we need to be thinking about how we can coordinate and govern to stem the challenges of climate change, which could destabilize sea lanes of communication. How do we manage piracy, human trafficking, food security, and human security issues? These will be disruptive forces on sea lanes of communication moving forward, especially as climate change continues to move apace. How do we manage these issues? Will say a lot about the stability of the broader Indo-Pacific region and the maritime domain. By way of example, I encourage you to think about what does it mean for sea lanes of communication and food security as sea levels rise within the region. In particular, the Mekong Delta is an area of particular sensitivity. It's the breadbasket or the rice basket for hundreds of millions of individuals. Without good governance and coordinating policy, as John mentioned, it's going to be an area of instability that will spill over into sea lines of communication. The last area that I think there's a lot of convergence in thinking about is resilience. Resilience in terms of supply chains, resilience in terms of dealing with economic coercion, and resilience in terms of dealing with black swan events like the COVID-19 pandemic. While divorced from directly from the maritime sea lanes, of course, a disruption in maritime sea lanes will affect supply chains and how we bring in goods to our economies. Economic coercion doesn't just happen in terms of trade, but it happens in the maritime domain as well. And of course, black swan events, whether it's a transnational pandemic or a natural disaster such as a tsunami, as we saw in 2005, these have huge possibilities or huge potential negative ramifications in terms of how sea lanes of communication will be managed and how we transport goods through those sea lanes of communication. Resilience, again, is becoming an important area of discussions in terms of Indo-Pacific stakeholders and thinking about how they can bypass or at least create more stability in sea lines of communication. And the maritime part, of course, requires coordination, but we also require coordination in terms of our investment in infrastructure and connectivity to create alternative production zones that can act as alternative centers of production when sea lanes of communication are disrupted. Last thing I think importantly is to focus on Taiwan. Taiwan is the center of many of the challenges within the region. We see increasingly assertive behavior across the Taiwan Straits, and Taiwan plays a critical role, not only in technology, but also in terms of sea lines of communication. How we inculcate stability and through rules into the Indo-Pacific and across the Taiwan Straits, how do we support a status quo? How do we govern the Taiwan Straits are important questions. And as John's mentioned, Japan and the United States, of course, are the biggest powers, perhaps in the region, aside from China. But what is the role for Canada? What is the role for Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the European in general in stabilizing these sea lines of communication and ensuring that the Taiwan Straits does remain an international waterway? These are key areas of coordination that we need to move forward and think about to ensure that the sea lines of communication that run in and around Taiwan remain stable and rules-based. I'll stop there. Thank you.